two tiny German shepherd puppies, curled together on a frozen porch, their fur stiff with ice, their eyes half closed against the storm. They had been left behind, forgotten by someone who never looked back. Inside that cabin, a man in uniform stared at them through the drifting snow. A Navy SEAL who once fought wars no one saw, carrying scars he never showed. He thought his battles were over. But when he saw those two trembling bodies clinging to each other for warmth, something inside him woke again. Because sometimes, the lives we save are the ones that remind us how to live. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. The world was white. Snow stretched endlessly across the ridges of Aspen like a sea that had forgotten to move. The storm had passed hours ago, but its silence still lingered. A silence so thick it pressed against the windows of the small log cabin tucked beneath the fir trees. Inside, the fire in the stone hearth had burned down to a low, patient glow. Elias Carter, 38 years old, stood beside it, rubbing warmth back into his hands. He had the kind of build that spoke of years spent carrying more than just his own weight. Broad shoulders, calm posture, the quiet readiness of a man who had seen the worst and survived it. His hair, short and dark with early streaks of gray, framed a face cut from discipline and fatigue. Sharp jawline, light beard, and eyes the color of winter steel. They were the eyes of a former Navy SEAL, the kind that had once scanned deserts for danger and now scanned the mountains for peace. Elias reached for his heavy wool coat, the one with a torn cuff from his last winter out here. He opened the cabin door to step outside and fetch more firewood. The hinges groaned. A current of cold air rolled in and wrapped around him. He drew a slow breath of it, the kind of air that burned the lungs clean. And then he froze. Two small shapes were curled tightly together on the porch floorboards, almost hidden beneath a drift of snow. They were so still that for a heartbeat, Elias thought they were lumps of ice or forgotten gloves. But then one of them shuddered, a faint, trembling movement, and he saw what they were. Two German shepherd puppies, no more than 6 weeks old, huddled so close they looked like one. Their fur was matted and crusted with frost, their paws stiff, their eyes half closed under flakes of snow. One lifted its head weakly when the door creaked open, and its tiny breath came out in a thin mist that vanished before it reached the air. Elias's first instinct was confusion. Out here, miles from the nearest town, there were no strays, no traffic, no one careless enough to leave dogs behind. He looked out across the clearing. Nothing but unbroken snow. No footprints. No tire marks. Whoever had brought them here had done it before the storm hit. Whoever it was hadn't come back. He knelt slowly, his boots crunching in the frost. His heart began to hammer in a way he hadn't felt since combat. Not from fear, but from something raw. That sharp ache that comes when the world shows you helplessness. "Hey there," he murmured, his voice low, steady, the same tone he used to calm soldiers younger than himself. "You're all right now. Easy." The larger pup, a male by the size of his frame, gave a weak whine, pressing his head protectively over the smaller one. Elias could feel heat rising behind his ribs, a mix of anger and sorrow. Someone had abandoned them here to die. He reached out a gloved hand but stopped midway. They were domestic, but frightened. Their eyes flicked between him and the open woods like torn decisions. From across the snow-covered lane came the crunch of footsteps and a voice that broke the silence like an old song. "Elias, you're up early for once." He turned and saw Margaret Hale, his neighbor from down the slope, or what passed for a neighbor out here. The woman was 68, wrapped in a long gray coat that seemed to hold the memory of every winter she'd lived through. Her silver hair escaped her knit hat in soft curls, her cheeks pink with cold. She walked with the careful steadiness of someone who refused to be slowed by age. "Morning, Margaret," Elias called back, still crouched by the porch. "You might want to stay where you are. It's cold enough to freeze your shadow out here." She smiled faintly, her breath a cloud. "And yet you're standing there talking to yourself again. What's got you staring at the ground?" Elias stepped aside, revealing the two tiny forms. Margaret's face changed instantly. Her humor melted into alarm. "Oh, sweet Lord," she whispered, coming closer. "They're just babies." "Yeah," Elias said softly. "Someone dumped them here. No tracks. They must have been out all night." Margaret crouched beside him, her old knees creaking in protest. Poor things. People can be cruel when they stop seeing life as life. Elias nodded but said nothing. He'd seen that kind of cruelty too many times, not just toward animals, but toward people, in war, in cities, in himself. He reached down again, his hand trembling slightly. The smaller pup, its fur darker around the muzzle and paws, gave a faint twitch, as if sensing warmth nearby. Elias could feel its tiny heartbeat when he touched it through the glove. Too slow, too fragile. Margaret looked at him, her eyes knowing. "You can't leave them, Elias." He gave a humorless laugh. "Can't save everything, Margaret. You of all people know that." "I do," she said. "But I also know the difference between giving up and being given a chance to try again." The wind picked up, carrying flakes across their faces. Elias stared at the pups. The smaller one's breathing hitched. The larger nudged it weakly, as if urging it to stay awake. Something stirred inside Elias. An echo of the night years ago, when he'd pulled a wounded teammate out of enemy fire, telling him the same thing. "Stay awake. Just stay with me." That man hadn't made it. But these two? Maybe they still could. Elias slid his hands beneath the puppies. They were light as air, yet his arms felt heavy. Heavy with the weight of choice. He gathered them gently, tucking their cold bodies against his chest. The male whimpered, a faint sound that somehow filled the whole porch. Margaret exhaled a long, visible sigh, her eyes softening. "There you go," she said quietly. "That's the man I remember." Elias didn't answer. He just nodded once, turning toward the open door. Warm light spilled from inside the cabin, painting golden streaks across the snow. Behind him, the mountains stood silent, witnesses to a moment small but irreversible. As he stepped back into the cabin, the heat hit him like memory. Sharp, real, forgiving. The puppies twitched in his arms, tiny hearts beating against his chest, and something inside him loosened. Something he hadn't realized was clenched for years. Elias closed the door behind him, shutting out the wind. He looked down at the fragile lives in his arms and knew without quite understanding why that bringing them in wasn't just about saving them. It was about saving himself. Elias carried both puppies into the cabin. A single decision that would change everything. The cabin smelled faintly of pine smoke and melting snow. Elias shut the door behind him and felt the stillness settle. A fragile, living silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the soft whimper of the two freezing creatures in his arms. He knelt beside the hearth, the warmth brushing against his face, thawing the cold that clung to his beard. The puppies lay still, trembling slightly, their fur stiff and clumped together with frost. He worked quietly, almost mechanically at first. Years of field discipline took over. He fetched a clean towel from a chest, dampened it with warm water, and began wiping the frost from their paws and ears. One of them, the larger male, flinched but stayed still, his small body twitching each time Elias's rough hands touched his skin. The other, smaller one, barely reacted at all. Its breathing was faint and uneven, the ribs visible beneath thin fur. Elias felt a prickle of worry crawl down his spine. "Don't give up on me," he muttered. His voice, though firm, carried a tenderness that surprised him. He hadn't spoken to anyone this softly in years. He wrapped the weaker puppy in one of his old flannel shirts and brought it closer to the fire. Its nose was cold and dry, its little tail motionless. The other pup, its fur darker with a patch of sandy brown across the muzzle, had managed to lift its head. Its eyes, black and glossy like river stones, followed Elias's every movement. There was something defiant about that gaze, fragile but stubborn. Elias almost smiled. "All right," he said quietly. "You've got a bit of fight in you." He poured a small bowl of lukewarm water and dipped his fingers in, letting droplets fall onto their tongues. The stronger pup licked instinctively. The smaller one only twitched. Elias frowned, searching his memory for something his mother used to do for stray animals. He rubbed his palms together until the skin burned, then cupped the little one gently and pressed it against his chest beneath his coat. He could feel the faint flutter of life, weak but steadying. The fire grew brighter, its orange glow filling the small wooden room. Shadows danced over the stone walls, over the rack of tools, the faded map of Colorado pinned beside the door. Elias glanced at the old clock above the mantel. Just past 7, though the storm outside made it feel like midnight. Then from outside came the muffled sound of boots on snow. A soft knock followed. Elias turned his head sharply, instinct flaring. Old habits die hard. He moved quietly to the door and cracked it open. Margaret stood there, holding a small covered pot wrapped in a towel. Snowflakes clung to her scarf, melting into her gray hair. "You forgot to eat again, didn't you?" she said, half teasing, half maternal. "I figured you might need something warm. I made oatmeal." Her eyes drifted to the floor where the puppies lay on the blanket. "Oh, bless their hearts," she breathed, stepping in. "They're alive?" "For now," Elias said, closing the door behind her. "One's stronger. The other one's still fighting." Margaret set the pot down on the table and knelt beside the fire. Her movements were slow but sure, the kind that came from a life spent taking care of small, fragile things. "I heard some talk in town," she said softly. "A family from out past Maple Creek left in a hurry last week. Lost their home to a foreclosure, I think. Some said they had dogs. Pups. Maybe these poor souls were theirs." Elias didn't answer right away. He stared at the weaker puppy, the tiny chest rising and falling like a fragile clock ticking against time. "People always find reasons to leave things behind," he said finally, voice low. Margaret looked at him knowingly. "And you always find reasons to pick them up." That drew a faint smile from him. "I guess I never learned to walk away." The smaller puppy twitched again, a tiny sound slipping from its throat. Elias leaned closer. Its eyes fluttered open, blue-gray, unfocused but alive. "There you are," he whispered. the words barely a breath. He reached out and stroked its head. The other pup, as if sensing movement, shuffled closer until their bodies touched. He watched them for a long moment, something stirring deep in his chest. "I should give them names," he said quietly. "Might make them feel real." Margaret smiled. "Names have power. Go on then." Elias looked at the stronger one first. Its dark fur gleamed in the firelight, like rippling water under moonlight. "You'll be River," he decided. Then he glanced down at the smaller one, its pale paws resting against his hand. "And you, Biscuit," he said, voice softening. "Because you're small and warm and impossible not to keep." Margaret chuckled. "River and Biscuit. That's quite the pair." The fire popped. For a while, neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, but the warmth in the cabin grew thicker, gentler. Elias finally rose and poured oatmeal into a bowl for her. "You shouldn't have come through that weather," he said, handing her a spoon. She waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, hush. I've lived through worse. You just make sure those two get through the night." He nodded, sitting across from her. The puppies had curled into each other now, their breathing slow but steady. River occasionally lifted his head, ears twitching at the sound of the fire, while Biscuit slept deeply, her small body finally relaxing. Margaret studied Elias for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "You look different tonight," she said. "Less like you're waiting for something to end." He stared into the flames, his jaw tightening. "I used to think peace meant silence. Out here, I learned it's not. It's this." He gestured toward the fire, the sleeping pups, the stillness that no longer felt empty. "It's something small that stays alive." Margaret's eyes softened. "Then you've already found more peace than most." When she finally stood to leave, Elias walked her to the door. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the forest silver and hushed. She paused at the step. "Elias?" "Yeah?" "Those little souls. Don't just save them. Let them save you too." He didn't reply, just watched her fade into the snowy trees until her lantern became a faint golden spark among the pines. When he turned back, the cabin felt warmer somehow, as if the fire had grown larger in her absence. He sat down by the hearth again, pulling the blanket tighter around River and Biscuit. The two stirred slightly, pressing into the fold of his arm, their tiny bodies radiating a fragile heat that reached deeper than the flames. He watched them until his eyes grew heavy. Outside, the night deepened over Aspen Ridge. The snow shone like glass under the rising moon, and inside the small wooden cabin, 2 lives, and perhaps 3, had found a fragile kind of safety. For the first time in years, Elias felt something close to belonging. He leaned his back against the wall, whispered into the warm air, "You're not alone anymore," and closed his eyes. That night, as the storm passed and the fire burned steady, 2 tiny hearts slept beneath the blanket of a man who no longer believed he could save anything. And yet, somehow, he already had. The morning came gray and heavy, the kind of light that made the snow look endless. Elias woke early, though he hadn't really slept. River was already up, padding clumsily around the cabin on oversized paws, sniffing everything within reach. Biscuit still slept near the hearth, her tiny body curled in the hollow of a wool blanket, chest rising and falling with fragile rhythm. Elias knelt beside her for a moment, his hand resting lightly on her side, feeling the faint thump of her heartbeat. "You're stronger today," he murmured. "Keep fighting, little one." He stood, slipped on his worn coat, and filled the kettle before stepping outside. The sky was low, the air thin with cold. His breath rose in quiet plumes. He wasn't sure why, but he felt he needed answers. The truck engine coughed to life reluctantly, a tired growl breaking the morning silence. The drive down to Aspen Ridge Town took nearly an hour. The mountain roads wound through pines heavy with snow, the tires crunching over frozen gravel. Elias's mind drifted as he drove, the hum of the engine pulling loose thoughts from the corners of memory. Patrol lights, desert heat, a radio call that had come too late. He forced the memories down and focused on the road. By the time he reached the small main street, the town was waking. Steam rose from the bakery chimney. The post office lights flickered on. A faded sign reading Everett's General Store and Animal Aid Board swung gently in the wind. He parked outside and stepped in. Inside, the store smelled faintly of hay, coffee, and wet boots. Behind the counter stood a man in his mid-40s, tall and lean, with sandy hair and a scruffy beard. His name tag read, Tom Everett. He looked up from sorting mail and gave Elias a friendly nod. "Morning there. You look like someone who's had a rough night." Elias returned the nod. "Morning. I need to post something on the board." Tom gestured toward a corkboard near the window, cluttered with flyers, lost pet notices, and handwritten ads. "Help yourself. What are you looking for? Dog? Cat? Goat? Or trouble?" "Dog," Elias said simply, fishing out a small piece of paper he'd written on before leaving. 2 German Shepherd puppies found near Aspen Ridge Cabin. No tags, no collar, looking for owner. He pinned it up with a thumbtack. Tom leaned over to read it. "German Shepherds, huh? You found them in the woods?" "On my porch," Elias replied. "They were almost frozen solid." Tom's brow furrowed. "Wouldn't be the first time. Folks think those cabins up the ridge are magic. Leave a box there. Hope some kind soul picks it up before the snow does." Elias frowned. "You mean this has happened before?" "Couple times," Tom said, shrugging. "Last winter, someone left a litter of hound pups near the ranger station. Before that, a cat tied in a crate outside the post office. We do what we can, but sometimes people just walk away." His voice softened at the edges, but there was weariness underneath, the kind that came from seeing too many small cruelties pile up over years. Elias studied the man for a moment, his jaw tightening. "You ever catch who does it?" Tom shook his head. "Nope. They don't come back for what they've thrown away." Elias thanked him, bought a bag of dog food, and headed out. The drive back felt longer. The snow had begun to fall again, light and slow, settling like dust over the windshield. Every few minutes, he glanced at the passenger seat where the bag sat, and something in him twisted. That quiet anger that came not from rage, but from helplessness. When he reached the cabin, the smoke from the chimney told him Margaret had been by. Sure enough, when he stepped inside, she was there, setting down a tray with 2 steaming mugs. "I thought you'd gone chasing ghosts," she said, with a teasing smile. "Something like that," Elias said, hanging his coat. "I went into town. Posted a notice?" Margaret nodded, sitting by the fire. "Did you find anything?" Elias hesitated before answering. "Just proof that people can be careless." She sighed, stirring her tea. The lines around her eyes deepened when she frowned. "That's true, dear. But not everyone leaves because they stop caring. Sometimes they just run out of ways to hold on." Elias sank into the chair opposite her. "You sound like you're speaking from experience." Margaret chuckled quietly. My husband, Daniel. He used to bring home every broken thing he found. Once found a limping fox out near the mill. Stayed up all night splinting its leg with a ruler and duct tape. The next morning, it bit him and ran off. He laughed about it for days. Said saving something wasn't about thanks. It was about proving to yourself you still could. Her gaze drifted to the puppies. I think you're a lot like him, Elias. You've just forgotten that part. Elias didn't respond at first. River had clambered onto the rug and was gnawing on a stray bootlace. Biscuit, smaller and paler, had found a patch of sunlight near the door. He watched them, feeling the strange warmth in his chest again, something like pride mixed with ache. Maybe, he said finally. Maybe I'm just tired of watching things fall apart. Margaret smiled softly. Then start by keeping these two together. They talked for a while longer. Margaret told him the town gossip, the baker's new oven that caught fire, the church fundraiser postponed by snow. Small, human things that made the world outside his head feel closer again. When she left, the snow had grown heavier, muffling her footsteps as she disappeared into the white. Elias stood at the window long after, watching River and Biscuit tumble across the floor, their clumsy paws leaving prints on the wooden boards. He thought of Tom Everett's words, of the nameless people who left these animals to fate. He thought of the nights overseas when he'd seen men abandon their wounded to save themselves. And then he thought of Daniel Hale, a man he'd never met, who once stayed up all night for a broken fox. There was a kind of echo in that memory, one that reached across years, from Margaret's past to his present, and it settled in him quietly. By dusk, the cabin was warm again, the storm outside forgotten. River had curled up by Elias's boots, Biscuit in the fold of a thick blanket near the fire. Their breathing was steady now, their fur dry and soft, the tremors gone. Elias knelt beside them, his hand resting gently on both small heads. You're safe here, he said softly. No more storms. The fire crackled, answering him in its quiet language of warmth and light. For the first time, he realized he wasn't thinking about finding their owners anymore. He was thinking about keeping them. He sat back, letting the decision sink in, as simple and irreversible as the falling snow outside. Elias looked at the two sleeping pups and said the words aloud, steady and certain. They'll stay with me. The days lengthened, and the blizzard that had once sealed the mountains began to loosen its grip. Aspen Ridge looked softer now, the snow still deep, but gleaming under sunlight instead of the ghostly gray of stormlight. Inside Elias's cabin, the scent of burning cedar mixed with the faint musk of wet fur. The place no longer felt like a shelter for one man. It pulsed with small, restless life. River was growing fast. His coat, black with streaks of golden tan, had thickened, and his paws seemed too big for his body, clumsy yet determined. He charged across the floorboards with all the grace of a soldier in his first drill, slipping on rugs, skidding into furniture, and recovering with proud dignity. Biscuit, smaller and lighter in color, moved more gently. Her fur was a pale gold that shimmered in the firelight. Though still thin and fragile, she had an affection that was constant, always watching Elias, always pressing her nose to his hand when he paused. Elias leaned against the kitchen counter one morning, a mug of coffee steaming in his palm. The air was crisp enough that his breath still showed. You two are trouble, he said quietly, watching River paw at the boot rack. The pup froze when Elias whistled softly, ears twitching upright. "Sit," Elias commanded, tone firm but calm. River hesitated, glanced at Biscuit, then obeyed. Biscuit tilted her head as if trying to understand the game, then slowly sat down beside her brother. Elias smiled. "Good," he murmured, reaching down to pat their heads. He had begun teaching them basic obedience, short, sharp commands that echoed his old field training. "Stay," "Come," "Down." Each word carried rhythm, timing, control. In the Navy, precision had meant survival. Out here, it meant communication. It was strange how easily the skills translated from men to dogs. He didn't realize it, but the structure soothed him too. Later that afternoon, Margaret arrived, bundled in her heavy brown coat and a knitted hat pulled low over her ears. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her breath white in the air. She carried a small basket with loaves of bread and something wrapped in wax paper. "Brought you lunch," she announced as she pushed the door open without waiting for him to invite her. "Figured you're too busy barking orders to feed yourself." Elias chuckled softly. "You're not wrong." She stomped snow from her boots, set the basket down, and crouched near the fire. Biscuit trotted over immediately, tail wagging weakly. "Oh, look at her," Margaret cooed, scratching the pup behind the ears. "She's still so tiny, but she's got spirit. Reminds me of my daughter when she was little." Elias blinked. "You never mentioned you had a daughter." Margaret's smile faltered for just a heartbeat. "Emily. She moved to Oregon years ago. Married a teacher, has 2 kids of her own now. We talk sometimes." Her voice softened. "But letters don't fill a house, Elias. They never do." Elias nodded slowly. "I wouldn't know. Haven't written anyone in years." Margaret turned to study him. "You should. Or at least tell someone about those ghosts you carry. You've got the look of a man who left too much unsaid." Elias stared into the fire. "There's not much worth saying." He paused, his voice quieter now. "I lost my team. Afghanistan, 2 years before I got out. One wrong call, one ambush we didn't see coming. I was the only one who made it out." Margaret said nothing, only watched him with patient eyes. Elias rubbed his thumb against his mug. "After that, the noise in my head never stopped. The city felt too loud, the silence too sharp. So I came here, thinking maybe I'd get lost in the snow long enough to forget." Margaret's hand rested briefly on his shoulder. "You didn't come here to forget, Elias. You came here to remember differently." The words lingered between them like smoke. That evening, as dusk bled over the ridge, Elias took River and Biscuit outside. The air was brittle, the snow deep but firm beneath his boots. "Let's see what you've got," he said, stepping into the clearing behind the cabin. He whistled once, sharp and short. River bounded forward, stopping only when Elias raised his hand. "Stay," Elias commanded. The dog froze, every muscle trembling with anticipation. Elias tossed a stick into the snow a few yards away. "Fetch!" River bolted, snow spraying behind him like silver dust. He found the stick, then pranced back proudly, tail high. "Good boy," Elias said, grinning. He turned to Biscuit. "Your turn, sweetheart." The smaller pup trotted forward, following River's scent trail but stopping halfway, confused by the maze of footprints. Elias crouched and called softly, "Find it, Biscuit. You can do it." She sniffed the snow again, hesitated, then suddenly darted toward the stick, tail wagging furiously. Elias laughed, a sound so rare that even he seemed surprised by it. When they returned inside, the cabin was warm again. Margaret was dozing on the chair by the fire, her knitting still in her lap. The dogs padded quietly to their blanket, curling together. Elias covered them with an old wool throw and took the seat opposite hers. The light flickered across her face, softening the wrinkles and casting faint gold into her silver hair. "You're good with them," she murmured, without opening her eyes. "Discipline and patience," he replied, "same as the field." She smiled faintly. "Or maybe you just needed something to take care of again." He didn't argue. Outside, the wind moaned faintly through the pines, but it no longer sounded lonely. It sounded alive. Later that night, long after Margaret had gone home, Elias sat at his desk, writing in a small notebook. He didn't know why he started. He just did. The words came out uneven, but honest. Day 20 since the storm. River's learning commands. Biscuit's stronger. The cabin feels different. Quieter, but not empty. He stopped, stared at the page, then closed the notebook. River stirred in his sleep, tail twitching. Biscuit sighed softly beside him. Elias lay down on the cot, one arm folded behind his head, listening to the rhythm of the fire and the two steady breaths beside it. For the first time in years, he didn't dream of gunfire or sand. He dreamed of snow, falling soundlessly across an open field, and two small paw prints trailing beside his own. And for the first time in years, Elias slept without nightmares, while River and Biscuit stood guard in their silent way. By early March, the snow began to retreat from the pines like a tired army in retreat. Patches of dark earth emerged from beneath the drifts, wet and glistening under the faint sunlight. The river that had slept under a sheath of ice started to murmur again, a low song of thawing and life. For the first time in months, the mountains carried not silence, but breath. Elias Carter noticed it in the smallest things: the lighter air, the scent of wet bark, the way River's fur no longer steamed when he came in from outside. River had grown into a sturdy young dog now, all lean muscle and confidence, his once clumsy legs steady with control. His coat had deepened into a striking black and tan, his chest broad, his amber eyes alert with curiosity and loyalty. Biscuit, though smaller and still a bit fragile, was graceful and quick, her fur softer and lighter in shade, her eyes a pale gold that always sought Elias's face before taking any step forward. Every morning, they waited by the door before he even reached for his jacket. "You don't wait for orders, do you?" Elias muttered, tying his boots with a grin. "Fine, let's go earn breakfast." He opened the door, and the two bolted into the clearing, paws kicking up loose snow and mud. He followed with a small whistle, his breath mixing with the mist. Their daily route wound through the forest path leading to the ridge's edge. Elias carried a walking stick and his old field rucksack, habit more than need. Sometimes he stopped near a fallen log and gave a sharp whistle, signaling the dogs to search. River darted through the underbrush like a soldier on patrol, weaving between trees, nose to the ground, while Biscuit followed his lead, cautious but determined. When River found what Elias had hidden, a small leather glove, a stone, a stick, he barked once and waited. "Good boy," Elias called. Biscuit, after sniffing the air for a moment, joined her brother proudly. Elias knelt and rewarded them each with a small dried treat. "You're learning faster than half the men I trained," he said softly, half to himself. In those moments, the ghosts that used to follow him felt quieter. The war inside his chest, the one made of guilt and memory, began to lose its sharpness. There was no radio static here, no echoes of gunfire, no dead weight of orders that couldn't be undone. There was only the rustle of pine needles, the crunch of thawing ground, and the sound of two dogs who loved him without question. By late afternoon, the sun hung low enough to spill honey-colored light through the trees. Elias would often sit on a large rock overlooking the valley, letting River and Biscuit roam nearby. He'd take out his notebook and write, just as he had started weeks ago. Small entries, fragments of thought. Day 65. River's stronger than ever. Biscuit still shy around strangers. Margaret's been quiet lately. The thaws early this year. That last note had started to worry him. He hadn't seen Margaret in nearly 4 days, which was unusual. Normally, she'd stop by every other morning with a jar of preserves or bread, scolding him gently about something. His beard, his habit of skipping breakfast, his stubborn refusal to fix his cabin roof. The silence from her side of the woods felt strange. On the 5th day, Elias decided to check. He took the narrow trail that wound between the firs and birches, River trotting ahead and Biscuit following close behind. Margaret's cabin stood on a gentle slope, smaller than his but neat. Smoke usually rose from its chimney like a steady signal. Now, only cold ash remained in the pit. Elias frowned. He knocked once. No answer. He knocked again, louder. Finally, he heard a shuffle from inside, followed by a faint voice. "Come in, Elias. Door's open." When he stepped in, the warmth hit him, but not from the fire. It was from the thick layers of blankets wrapped around Margaret's legs. She sat in her chair near the hearth, pale and tired, her gray hair loose around her shoulders. There was a faint swelling around her left ankle, visible even under the wool socks. Elias's brow tightened. "Why didn't you tell me you were hurt?" Margaret waved a hand dismissively. "It's nothing, dear. I slipped a few days ago on the porch step. Just a bruise." "That's not just a bruise," Elias said, crouching down to examine it. "You could have twisted something." "I've had worse raising a family," she said with a faint smile. But her voice trembled, and that told him more than her words. Elias sighed. "You're as stubborn as I am." "Well," she replied, "someone has to match you." He looked around her cabin, neat but untouched. Dishes still in the sink, a few logs scattered near the fireplace. He stood. "I'll fix the steps outside and clear the ice. Then I'll bring you some firewood." Margaret frowned. "Elias, you don't have to—" "Stop arguing. You're not winning this one." Outside, the steps were slick with half-melted snow and a layer of ice. He worked for hours with his axe, splitting wood, scraping ice, and rebuilding the bottom railing. River sat nearby, watching every move, tail wagging as if this were another drill. Biscuit stayed closer to the door, occasionally padding inside to check on Margaret. When he finally came back in, cheeks flushed and breath heavy, Margaret was watching him with a soft expression. "You remind me so much of Daniel," she said quietly. "He used to fix everything that wasn't even broken." Elias brushed off the snow from his shoulders. "I think you give me too much credit." She shook her head. "No, I don't. You're learning to live again, and that's harder than fixing steps." He poured her a cup of hot tea and settled into the chair across from her. "You know," he said, "I think I used to believe people could only be useful if they were fighting for something. And now I think maybe it's the opposite. Maybe you start to heal when you stop fighting everything." Margaret smiled, lines deepening around her eyes. "Then I'd say you're on the right path, soldier." When Elias left, the sun was setting behind the ridge. River and Biscuit ran ahead through the open path, kicking up melting snow that glittered like scattered glass. He paused halfway home, watching them play. River bounding high, Biscuit darting between his legs. For a moment, the laughter came easily. It felt new, but it also felt right. At the cabin, twilight painted the room in soft amber light. Elias set down his pack, leaned by the window, and watched the two pups tumble across the clearing until they finally collapsed together in the grass, panting and happy. He smiled, a small, genuine thing that reached his eyes this time. Spring had come quietly, not just to the mountain, but to him. And for the first time, Elias realized that the world was thawing, inside and out. The morning broke sharp and silver over the peaks. A pale mist rolled through the trees like breath from something ancient, clinging to the pines that stood dark against the sky. The air smelled of melting snow and wet stone, and Elias Carter felt the ache of early cold seep into his bones as he strapped his boots and tightened his jacket. He had planned to hike the upper ridge of Frozen Peak to mark new trail points for the coming summer season, an old habit from his military days where mapping and terrain reading had once meant survival. Now it was just something to keep his hands busy and his mind quiet. River barked once at the cabin door, tail wagging in excitement, while Biscuit tilted her head as if questioning the day's purpose. "Not today, you two," Elias said with a half smile, kneeling to ruffle their fur. "Stay with the house. I won't be long." River whined softly, pressing his nose against Elias's palm. "I mean it," Elias added, his voice low but gentle. "Guard the cabin. That's an order." He set off with his rucksack slung across one shoulder, the air crisp and light around him. The snow had begun to melt on the lower slopes, leaving patches of slick ice hidden beneath the thin crust of white. The sun hovered weakly behind the clouds, offering light but little warmth. As he ascended, the forest thinned, the pines giving way to bare rock and scattered brush. He paused occasionally, marking coordinates in a small notepad, noting fallen branches and unstable ridges. The rhythm of movement, climb, step, breathe, had always been his kind of meditation. By noon, the wind picked up. The higher elevation carried a cold that felt sharper, more alive. Elias adjusted his scarf and glanced down the slope. The valley below was awash of gray and green, the river glinting faintly through the trees. He took one careful step forward, and that's when it happened. The snow beneath his boot gave way without warning. He felt the world drop out from under him, and for an instant, everything became motion. The crack of ice, the rush of air, the sickening jolt as his body slammed against rock. He tumbled down a shallow incline, striking his shoulder, his ribs, until he hit a ledge hard enough to knock the breath from his lungs. Silence followed, broken only by his ragged gasp. Pain radiated up from his right leg, hot and sharp, like a knife turned in the bone. He tried to move, but his body screamed in protest. "Damn it," he hissed, clutching at his thigh. His fingers came away wet. Blood. He reached up, pulling himself to a sitting position, but his vision blurred. The leg was bent at a wrong angle, swollen under the fabric. One look told him enough. It was broken. For a moment, he simply sat there, breathing hard, trying to steady his mind. Years of training kicked in. Slow the heart, assess surroundings, find cover. He scanned the slope. He had fallen into a shallow ravine, flanked by jagged stone and snow-packed earth. Above him, the ledge he'd slipped from looked impossibly high now, its edge crumbling. He reached for his backpack, fingers trembling. Inside was a small thermos, a knife, a roll of gauze, and his field radio, a civilian model with limited range. He flicked the switch. Static. He tried again. Nothing. The nearest ranger station was miles away, and even if the signal carried, there was no guarantee anyone would hear him this late in the day. The wind rose again, howling through the pass, cutting into him like glass. He leaned back against the rock, jaw clenched. The pain in his leg pulsed with every heartbeat. He thought about binding it, about crawling back down the slope toward the tree line, but the distance seemed endless. "Think, Elias," he muttered under his breath. "You've been through worse." But the truth was cruel. He hadn't. Combat wounds had always come with backup, with medics, with the promise of rescue. Here, there was only the mountain, indifferent and immense. As the light dimmed, shadows spilled across the ravine. The temperature plummeted fast. Elias wrapped his coat tighter, his breath coming in small white bursts. Each exhale felt thinner than the last. He knew the signs. Hypothermia could kill faster than blood loss. Back at the cabin, the day wore on quietly. Margaret Hale sat by her window, knitting in the fading light, her right leg propped on a small stool. Her ankle, though healing, still throbbed when the weather turned cold. She looked toward the trail beyond the trees, expecting to see a figure emerging from the snow. Elias usually stopped by around dusk, bringing kindling or conversation. But as the hours stretched, worry began to knot in her chest. She tried to brush it off. He was probably fine, out longer than usual. Yet the silence outside grew heavy, like a weight pressing against the walls. She stood slowly, leaning on her cane, and stepped onto the porch. The mountain air bit at her face, sharp and biting. "Elias," she called into the distance. The only answer was the rustle of wind through the pines. She frowned. "You'd better not be lost out there, boy," she muttered, retreating inside. She reached for the phone on her counter, an old landline that sometimes cut out when the weather turned. The dial tone buzzed faintly. She hesitated, then put it down again. He'd come back, she told herself. He always did. Night descended over Frozen Peak, like a curtain. The stars blinked cold and far away. In the ravine, Elias's world had shrunk to a narrow circle of pain and breath. He tried to move once more, dragging himself a few inches toward a flatter patch of ground, but the agony in his leg forced him still. He leaned back, staring at the darkening sky. Snowflakes began to fall again, light, delicate, but relentless. His thoughts wandered to the cabin, to the crackling fire, to River's bark, to Biscuit's gentle nudge against his hand. He wondered if they sensed it, the wrongness in the air. He laughed once under his breath, a sound more like a cough. "You two better not eat the couch while I'm gone," he whispered, his words carried away by the wind. Then, faintly, through the howl of the storm, came a sound that didn't belong to the mountain. A bark. He froze, straining to listen. It came again, sharp, insistent, familiar. River's bark. And then another, softer but steady. Biscuit. The sound echoed down the slope, cutting through the wind like an answer to a prayer. Elias's chest tightened, his heart racing. "No," he breathed. "You stayed." The barking grew closer, urgent, moving across the ridge. He could almost see them in his mind. River leading, Biscuit following, noses to the ground, tails low against the cold. A flicker of hope stirred in his chest, fragile but fierce. He tried to call out, but his voice cracked. He managed only a whisper. "Here, I'm here." The wind swallowed the words, yet the barking didn't stop. It grew louder, nearer. And as darkness fell completely, Elias let his head rest against the cold stone, breath shallow but steady, listening to the sound of loyalty fighting through the storm. Somewhere in the distance, River and Biscuit were coming for him. The night deepened across the mountain, cloaking the slopes of Frozen Peak in a shroud of wind and darkness. Snow fell heavier now, the flakes thick and relentless, blurring the line between sky and earth. Elias lay half buried near the edge of the ravine, his breath coming in shallow bursts. His body trembled uncontrollably, his vision hazed by exhaustion and cold. The pain in his broken leg pulsed in waves, dull now, the dangerous numbness of fading consciousness. The cold had crept beneath his skin and was slowly stilling everything inside him. River appeared first, bursting through the snowdrift like a shadow come to life. His fur, wet and dusted with frost, glistened under the dim light of a rising moon. He bounded to Elias's side, whining sharply, nudging the man's arm with his nose. "River," Elias whispered, voice barely audible. His lips were cracked and pale. The dog barked once, loud and desperate, then began licking his face, pushing against his chest as if trying to stir his master awake. Biscuit arrived seconds later, smaller but no less determined, panting hard from the climb. Her pale coat was nearly invisible against the snow, except for the dark outline of her ears and eyes. She pressed her muzzle to Elias's hand, then looked toward the slope, as if she understood something River didn't. That help had to come from beyond this mountain hollow. River refused to leave his side. He stood guard, pacing in tight circles, barking occasionally into the void as though daring the storm itself to answer. Elias, fighting the pull of sleep, managed to reach out, resting his shaking hand on the dog's head. "Good boy. Stay with me," he murmured. Then Biscuit made her move. She turned and darted toward the lower ridge, following the faint scent of the main hiking trail where she and Elias had walked before. Her paws punched through the snow, leaving a dotted trail behind her. She ran until the forest opened to a wider slope, then stopped, barked once, and ran back toward Elias. She did it again, and again, each time her tracks etched deeper into the white, forming a visible pattern, a circular mark around the hollow where Elias lay. In her small, instinctive way, Biscuit was drawing attention, a sign no human could ignore. Hours passed like fragments of dreams. The snow softened its fall, and somewhere down the mountain, a group of hikers from the nearby town of Silver Creek moved carefully along the trail. They were three, a young couple and an older man guiding them. The leader, Peter Haskins, was a seasoned outdoorsman in his early 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a grizzled beard and steady gray eyes. He had spent most of his life in the Rockies, teaching survival skills to tourists who wanted to feel the wild without being consumed by it. He knew the mountain's moods, and tonight something in the air felt wrong. "Hold up," he said suddenly, raising his hand. The wind whistled between the trees, carrying a sound faint but distinct, barking, urgent, repeating. The young woman, Lena, slender with a knitted red scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, frowned. "Is that a dog?" Peter nodded slowly. "Two, maybe, and close." He motioned for the others to follow. Their flashlights swept across the trees, beams cutting through the falling snow until they caught movement, a small shape darting back and forth along a narrow ridge. Biscuit. She barked louder as the lights appeared, bounding toward them, then running back in the opposite direction, as if saying, "This way, follow me." Peter's instincts flared. "That's not random," he said. "She's leading us somewhere." He and the others followed, trudging through the deep snow as Biscuit guided them toward the ravine. River's bark grew audible then, lower, deeper, the sound of a guardian refusing to yield. When they reached the hollow, the beam of Peter's flashlight froze on the site below. A man, motionless, half covered in snow, one leg twisted unnaturally. River stood beside him, hackles raised, eyes glowing in the beam, protective but not aggressive. "Easy, boy," Peter said calmly, kneeling down. He saw the navy tattoo on Elias's wrist beneath the torn sleeve, the steady but weak pulse at his throat. "He's alive," Peter called out. The others hurried to help. Peter pulled a satellite phone from his pack and contacted the nearest ranger station. "We've got an injured man near Frozen Peak Ridge. Coordinates." He read them off quickly, then tore open an emergency blanket. River sniffed anxiously as the man wrapped it around Elias. "You did good, boy," Peter murmured, looking between the two dogs. "You kept him alive." Within 40 minutes, the rescue team arrived, headlights cutting through the darkness, boots thudding against the frozen ground. Paramedics moved swiftly, securing Elias to a stretcher, splinting his leg, checking his breathing. River refused to step aside until one of them gently patted his head, whispering reassurance. Biscuit sat beside her brother, tail curled around her paws, her wide golden eyes following every move. When the ambulance door shut, River and Biscuit whined softly, noses pressed against the cold metal. Peter crouched beside them. "Don't worry," he said. "You two are coming too." He lifted Biscuit into his arms and whistled for River to jump into the back seat of the rescue truck. The drive down the mountain was long and winding. The storm had quieted, replaced by the hum of the engine and the rhythmic breathing of the man who had once thought he would die alone. At the Silver Creek Medical Center, Margaret was already there, her hair damp with melted snow, her cane clutched tightly in one hand. She had called the local rangers after sensing something wrong when the night stretched too long without word from Elias. Now, standing in the sterile white hallway, she felt her knees weaken when the stretcher rolled in. "Elias," she whispered. The paramedic, a young man with kind eyes, assured her, "He's stable, lucky man. Those dogs of his might have saved him." Margaret looked down the hall where River and Biscuit sat beside an orderly, their fur still wet, but their tails flicking softly. She shuffled toward them and knelt as best she could, stroking their heads. "You found him, didn't you?" Her voice trembled. "You clever, brave babies." River leaned against her knee, while Biscuit pressed her small face into her palm. When Elias finally regained consciousness, the first thing he saw was Margaret sitting beside his hospital bed, her eyes swollen from crying, but shining with relief. The second thing he saw, through the glass window, were River and Biscuit resting together under a heat lamp outside the ward door. "You gave us all a scare," Margaret said softly, squeezing his hand. "But you're home now." Elias swallowed hard, voice hoarse. "They came for me," he said. "They didn't stop until they found me." Margaret smiled through her tears. "Of course they did. You saved them first, remember?" Elias turned his head toward the window again. River lifted his gaze, meeting his master's eyes. Biscuit wagged her tail faintly, her expression calm, certain. In that look, Elias felt something shift inside him. the deep, wordless understanding that life had chosen to return what he had given. That night, as snow continued to fall softly beyond the hospital walls, Elias Carter slept, alive and whole, under the silent watch of his two angels. Summer arrived in Aspen Ridge quietly, like a long-forgotten promise being kept. The mountains, once locked beneath the grip of snow, now shimmered under sunlight. The river beside the cabin ran free again, its sound like laughter through the trees. Grass pushed through the soil in shades of green so vivid it almost hurt the eyes, and wildflowers spread across the valley floor. Gold, violet, white, like little flames of life rekindled. Elias sat on the porch of his cabin, the same place where months ago he had found two trembling shapes in the snow. His right leg rested on a stool, healed enough for him to walk without the crutch most days. The scar beneath his jeans still ached sometimes when the weather turned, but it was a quiet pain now, one that reminded him he had survived. River and Biscuit darted across the meadow in front of the cabin, their coats glossy under the afternoon sun. River had grown into a magnificent young dog, tall, strong, and confident. His fur gleamed in layers of deep black and bronze, his eyes sharp and intelligent. Biscuit remained smaller, delicate but graceful, her golden fur catching the light like soft fire. She ran in quick circles around River, her barks bright and musical. He'd chase her, let her win, then pretend to be defeated, tail wagging proudly. Elias watched them, his coffee growing cold in his hands. The warmth of the day soaked into his skin, and for the first time in years, he felt no urgency to do anything. No ghosts waiting in the corners of his mind. No orders to follow. No noise. Just peace, and the faint hum of a life rebuilt from silence. He thought back to the night of the storm, to the ravine, to the sound of paws breaking through snow when hope had been nearly gone. He remembered the weight of River's body pressed against him, the way Biscuit had vanished and returned with help. It still astonished him that such small lives had carried such immense courage. "They saved me," he murmured to himself, a quiet wonder in his voice. "They really did." The porch creaked softly behind him. He turned to see Margaret Hale walking up the path with slow, careful steps, her cane tapping against the ground. She wore a wide straw hat and carried a basket covered with a checkered cloth. Her gray hair, tied neatly at the nape of her neck, glowed almost silver in the sun. "Well," she said with a smile, "you look alive again." Elias chuckled. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" Margaret climbed the steps, her breath steady but shallow. "Strange is just another word for new beginnings," she said, handing him the basket. "Apple pie. My first in months. I thought we could both use something sweet that doesn't come from a can." Elias set the basket down gently. "You didn't have to, Margaret." She waved off his protest. "Oh, hush. You've done enough fixing for both of us." River bounded up to her, tail wagging so hard it brushed her dress. "And there's my hero," she said, scratching behind his ears. Biscuit followed, sitting politely at her feet, head tilted up expectantly. "And the Lady of Grace," Margaret added fondly. Elias poured 2 cups of coffee, handed one to her, and leaned against the railing. "You know," he said after a pause, "I still can't figure out how they found me that night. It was miles from here. No scent trail should have lasted that long in the snow." Margaret took a sip and smiled faintly. "Love finds its way, Elias. It always does." He looked at her, unsure how to answer. She went on softly, You saved them when you had nothing left to give. Maybe they remembered that. Maybe when the world turned against you, they just did what you once did for them, refused to give up. Elias stared at the meadow, where the dogs now wrestled playfully in the grass. You make it sound like I'm part of some miracle. Maybe you are, she said simply. Maybe you've been one all along. People like you. You break, but you don't stay broken. That's what makes you worth saving. Her words hit him in a place deeper than pain, a place where something long sealed began to open again. For a while, they both sat in silence, sipping coffee, the air filled with the sounds of summer. After a while, Margaret shifted in her chair, wincing slightly from her leg. You know, she said, I used to believe that people leave and don't come back. My husband, my daughter, time itself, they all moved on without me. But then I met you, and those dogs. And I realized something. Elias looked over. What's that? Margaret smiled, her eyes soft with memory. That those who love truly, people or animals, always find their way home. Elias couldn't speak for a long moment. The air thickened with quiet emotion. He nodded finally, his voice rough when he said, I think you're right. Margaret stood with effort, brushing off her skirt. Of course I'm right. Now stop brooding and go enjoy the sunshine. You've earned it. She patted his shoulder and started back down the path, her cane tapping rhythmically against the dirt. Elias watched her disappear into the trees, the sound of her steps fading into birdsong. He looked out again at River and Biscuit. They had tired themselves out and now lay side by side under a patch of wildflowers, panting contentedly. The sight filled him with a tenderness so fierce it almost hurt. He stood slowly, walked toward them, and knelt down in the grass. Both dogs lifted their heads, tails thumping weakly. Elias reached out and pulled them close, his arms around their warm bodies. River pressed his muzzle against Elias's shoulder, while Biscuit licked his wrist with small, soft strokes. He felt their hearts beating against his chest, strong, steady, alive. Thank you, he whispered, for everything. The wind stirred gently through the meadow, carrying the scent of pine and blooming flowers. Above them, the sky stretched endless and blue, unmarred by storm or shadow. For the first time since his years of service, Elias didn't feel like a man defined by what he'd lost. He felt like someone who had been given back, piece by piece, by two small souls who refused to let him fade away. He leaned back on his elbows, watching the clouds drift lazily across the horizon. The sunlight warmed his face, and somewhere deep inside, something quietly settled. Peace, simple and complete. The laughter of the river echoed in the distance. River barked softly, as if answering it. Biscuit nuzzled against Elias's hand, eyes half closed in contentment. And for the first time in years, Elias Carter smiled. The kind of smile that comes from being found, not once, but twice. The sky above was clear, endless, and full of light. And so, at last, was his life. Sometimes, miracles don't come as flashes of light or thunder from the heavens. They arrive on quiet mornings, wrapped in fur and loyalty, reminding us that God's grace often walks on four paws. Elias's story isn't just about rescue. It's about redemption, about how love given freely always finds its way back, even when we think we're too lost to be found. In every act of kindness, every choice to care when it would be easier to turn away, the Lord works unseen, turning cold winters into new beginnings. If you believe that miracles still happen in the smallest corners of life, in a stranger's compassion, in an animal's devotion, in the quiet faith that tomorrow can be better, then share this story with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and join us in spreading faith, love, and the reminder that no one is ever truly alone. May God bless you and everyone you hold dear, and may His grace guide all of us home.